Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. We have a pretty distinguished panel today, so I don't want to make introductions, or I want to just jump straight into the topic. Clearly, we're coming off a very interesting period. Now, in the news in the last couple of days have obviously focused on Greece, but if you sort of drop down two headlines below, you would see that they're also talking about Asia's slowdown and the fact that we're coming off a 7-week decline in the stock markets. So really the question is Asia sustainable? Is Asia going to be able to last? Are we seeing the beginning of that slowdown that people have talked about? Or is Asia really a force to be reckoned with? I want to start off by posing our first question to Mr. Ivan Ritoso, and just to say, how sustainable is the Asian market?
Thanks, Basil. Look, I think to really answer that question is to ask how sustainable is China growth. And, you know, I think that's the main issue, not only for Asia growth, but also for global growth. And to give you some colour there, just to, if you look at global growth over the last decade, a third of global growth has come from China. And if you add back the other Asian countries, more than half of global growth has come from the Asia region. And so China is not only important for Asia, but I would also say hugely important for global growth. And you can see that manifesting itself in the real world today. And if you ask the question, why has Canada decoupled from the US? Why has Brazil decoupled from Latin America? Why has Australia decoupled from New Zealand? And in fact, why has Germany decoupled from the rest of Europe? And even if you look at Africa and think that less than 8 years ago they were looking for debt forgiveness, today they're growing strongly. And the answer is they all have what China needs, which is commodities, and in Germany's case, capital goods. To answer how sustainable is China's growth and therefore Asia's growth, you know, I go to China a lot, and it really stuns me the amount of change and development in such a short period of time over the last 5 to 10 years. And it's not really just in Beijing and Shanghai, as a lot of Western commentators think. It's really across the entire country. And I'll give you some examples of what's going on in China today. They're building, at the moment, an additional 33,000 kilometres of railway, and they're investing $400 billion in that at the moment. They're also building 350 million square metres of residential and commercial real estate. And to put that in perspective, that's about a third of the size of the entire floor space in Moscow. And we're also seeing strong consumer growth in China. Today, China is the biggest car market in the world. Last year, they bought twice as many cars as the US. They bought 18 million cars. And Shanghai is the biggest and busiest port in the world. And as I said, so there's a lot going on. And you see that when you fly across the country and look out the window. And there's just cranes and development everywhere. There's high-speed railways being built, highways being built, dams being built, cities, towns, etc. And so my view is that even if you don't have any new development, just to finish off the current construction is going to keep China growth going for the next 3 to 5 years. And that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but you can see that it's just got a natural momentum from here. However, there are risks, and we need to be aware of those risks. And the risks really come from two things, and it comes from China's response to the global financial crisis. And the first thing they did was they embarked on a very big fiscal stimulus package. It was equivalent to 7% of their GDP over 2 years. And they also increased money supply by nearly 80% between 2008 and 2010. So that's an incredible amount of stimulus. And inevitably, when you get that stimulus, you're going to get what you see today, inflation coming in China, which is the risk that you put forward, Basil. And I think, therefore, there's two things that we need to be cognizant of. One is that they're trying to slow the economy down. You can see the revaluation of the renminbi, the draining of reserves, the increasing of interest rates. But the danger is they overcook it. And instead of a gentle slowdown, we get a hard landing. And I think there, as I said before, the ramifications are large for China, but also Asia and the rest of the world. If you think about places like Australia and Korea, where more than a quarter of their exports go to China. Australia is, the currency is significantly overvalued. You can see a real problem happening there if we get a hard landing in China. But also the US. People forget that China is the US biggest export market, so you can also see a slowdown in the US. I think the second area of risk is around the inefficient allocation of resources. And as we know, a lot of lending and investment in China is state-directed. Banks have increased their balance sheet fourfold over 6 years, and we've seen investment growing by over 10% for the last decade per annum in China. So inevitably, the danger is you get an inefficient allocation of resources and some poor lending decisions. And so the danger of a significant slowdown is non-performing loans, and we're already starting to see some of that, particularly out in the provinces. And also, as I said, an inefficient allocation of resources. And there is a debate, is that happening around real estate? Is that happening around manufacturing? I don't think a hard landing is the core scenario. I think you're going to see growth slow from 10.5% last year to the high 8%. But they're the risks to be aware of.
So let's stay with the China theme for a second. Truly, you write, your newspaper writes about the financial markets in China. Do you see it the same way? Do you see these risks, or do you see different risks?
Yeah, I think it is clearly China's economy is going to be slow, or slower, I should say, but which I think is very good for China. Actually, the situation that the slower is a situation that the rational, the wise economists has expected for recent couple of years and warned about the dangers of bubbles for a long time. So we see it's a positive trend if China's economy can get really, really slower. And I don't see any real challenge risks for the hard landing. I'm quite confident and very optimistic about the long-term future, mainly because if there's a slower economy and we can get better economic environment for the real business to get growth. I should say, I'm not going to talk about the numbers today, but I just want to discuss with you about what's behind the growth of China. That is why I'm confident about. In addition to conventional causes such as market reform that is attributed to China's growth, I think there's 3 points I want to make. I think the reason China's growth, I'm about the sustainable growth, at the first is the legacy of capitalism in China. Despite the old perception of China as a communist country, planned economy in China only has 20 to 25 years history. Before China had internal turmoil such as Cultural Revolution, and then eventually opened up to the market economy. The legacy of capitalism was not completely killed in a short time of planned economy. Once it was allowed, it revived and thrived very fast. Secondly, flexibility. We all know that the rule of law is still weak in China. One side effect of that, however, is flexibility in companies' operation and the people's work. Rules can change. You have to be nimble, to act fast and adjust fast. This gives rise to a vibrant private sector. Third, the very strong willing of Chinese people to improve their lives. You see that in Chinese merchants in Moscow, and also in half a billion migrant workers traveling across country for better life, and in millions of entrepreneurs who fight to survive and struggle to innovate. These are some engines behind the Chinese growth, which I think I'm very confident about. But what is the looming risk? And I share some ideas, some opinions from my colleagues here. I think the growth in China is vulnerable as well. Besides inflation and state intervention, there are conflicts and unrest. There are huge gaps between rich and poor, east and west, and there are disputes, sometimes conflicts between Chinese and foreign investors, On top of that, there is expanding power of vast interests. Internationally, people want China to grow, especially in Russia, which is rich in resources. And China has a demand, but why Chinese and Russian can hardly do business together? My answer is because we have lots of similarities, not differences. Similarities between China and Russia's societies, like communist legacy, the lack of transparency, the lack of the rule of law, and the corruption. And I call that handover of communism, which we both dislike and want to get rid of. Because we know each other's problems so well, this handover prevents us to move closer together. I will stop here and hope to hear more from our panelists and
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate it. And I think I knew we were going to get onto China quickly. We got onto it very quickly. So I just want to open it up to the rest for what about the other Asian markets? Asia is not only China. What about the other markets? Chev, India, is it sustainable, that growth? Inflation seems to be a problem.
Yeah, I think the recent inflation. Is this on? I think the recent inflation worries, and some concerns about overheating, in that sense, are concerns. However, I think that one needs to look at India as still largely a domestic story. India is a huge consumer market. Connectivity to the world is still limited. Of course, in the last 20 years, since '91, India has opened up a lot more to global investment and so on. But it's very much a domestic consumer story. And we're adding 20 million people every year that are coming on stream into the middle class, defined in terms of Indian per capita incomes and purchasing power parity. But that is creating domestic demand for domestic businesses. And I think that is the core engine that's driving the India story. And it's a bottom-up story rather than a top-down story. We have lots of entrepreneurs, lots of entrepreneurial businesses emerging and building value, apart from the larger sort of multinational groups, Indian or global, as well as the state groups. But I think the domestic story is very exciting in that sense. So I think, yes, there may be some blips along the way, but if one really takes a slightly longer perspective, I think the Indian growth story is very real and very fundamental.
Thank you. Let me go to Dominic for a second and say, okay, if you were consulting to the Asian economies, what would you say to them in terms of what they should adjust in their plans right now? Greece, Japan, all of these new factors, how do we adjust for those?
Maybe a couple of things to start off with. I very much share the view that others have. I'm bullish on Asia, both China, India, but also Indonesia. I just wanted to throw in, we always forget about Indonesia. This is a 240 million person economy that's had wonderful growth rates for the last few years, but it's kind of one of the biggest secrets in the world, and they're moving, ASEAN. So I think there's this urbanization that Julie talked about, which is a gravitational force that you can't stop. 1.3 million people a week are moving from rural to cities, and I think that's very difficult to stop that. Even in China, they've not been able to do that. So I think those are forces there. But to your question, I would suggest a couple of things. One, I think, is probably a very obvious one, which is that the Asia region has to shift much more from an export investment-driven system to a consumption-driven system. And that's vital for all of us. And I think China is trying very hard. I think consumption's roughly about 35% or so of GDP. Trying to get it to 42 is a big step, but that would, so I would be pushing very much the consumption side of things. And to me, one of the key areas of consumption is services. The services sector in Asia is pathetically small. If I was to show you yellow pages of New York, Manhattan, and then compare that to the yellow pages of Beijing, or the yellow pages of Seoul, or the yellow pages of Jakarta, it would be that there's just not the services sector. And part of that's because of regulations. It's interesting, the mayor of Beijing had a sign in his office which compared the amount of time it takes to start a new services business, an SME, and it takes about 36 days in Beijing. It takes about 5 days in Singapore. And so I think we've got to enable more small businesses that actually are focused on services, not on on the big heavy industry type of things is going to be very important. A second area is actually is infrastructure. Infrastructure is a $8 trillion opportunity over the next 10 years. But what's interesting is in Asia, and I'm generalizing, there aren't really the pension fund development that's there, the long-term savings. So, and the people that have the long-term savings, the sovereign wealth funds, are investing overseas. They're not investing in Asia. And so I would recommend, too, that we try and deepen the capital markets. It's not a very popular thing to say these days. I would actually move to a deeper, more non-bank-based system to allow people to invest in these major infrastructure projects, which will improve the service sector and the consumer sector and the integration of Asia. So it's services, it's infrastructure and pension reform. And I think the opening up of trade. I mean, ASEAN, I'll just give you an example, the non-tariff barriers to trade a product between Indonesia and Thailand are quite unbelievable. How they measure certain items is slightly different. And I think you've got to blast that out of the way, and you're going to get more trade, which will actually occur. And I think that can also improve things.
I guess since we asked the question about deepening the capital markets, I got to jump to Ivan for a second and say, can it be done? In Barclays Capital, you seem to be going to China a lot. That's good news, but is it something that can be done? Can we deepen that pool of money?
Yeah, look, it can be done and is being done. You know, I think it's a multi-speed process. If you look at the work that the HKMA are doing, you know, they're very advanced. If you look at the MAS in Singapore, they're very advanced. I'd even say China with CNH and CNY and CNS, you know, the offshore trading of the renminbi. And if anything, you know, you're seeing an acceleration of reform and change and therefore liquidity. You look at Korea and Taiwan, you know, these I wouldn't even call them emerging markets. I mean, they're developed countries, developed markets, and I can't see any difference between, you know, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. I mean, these are all industrial countries. The other end of the scale, you have, you know, Indonesia that's still developing its financial markets. And, you know, Thailand, we know about the issues there. And then the one that's somewhat been left behind, interestingly enough, is Malaysia. And if you sort of think about where Malaysia was back in '96 and pre the '97 crisis in Asia, relatively to the other Asian countries compared to where they are today, they've got some catching up to do. I would also add something, you asked me about financial markets, I'd also add something about trade that Dominic touched on, and I think, you know, clearly the issues of improving the friction in trade between these countries and also financial markets. We need to remember that even though they're all in Asia, they often see each other as each other's biggest competitors in the region. And so, you know, there's that natural inbuilt friction in trade and finance and elsewhere between these countries that I think over time will change, but it's definitely there today.
Professor Chen, Hong Kong, is that really the model? You know, we talk about how successful it's been, and you know, what can we learn from Hong Kong? What can we learn from some of the developed parts of Asia, let's say?
Well, thank you. Hong Kong is very unique. Hong Kong, Singapore are very unique among Asian economies and countries because both of them are very small. But I think the kind of development model that Hong Kong and Singapore have followed have actually set some kind of standard for the rest of Asian countries. If you look at, you know, the Asian countries, the developed countries, let's count, you know, Korea, Taiwan, you know, Hong Kong, of course, Singapore, and then China considered developing. You know, if you look at all these, you know, the economies, actually they have taken different kind of paths in the past. But I think over the last 10 years, especially after the Asian financial crisis, you see more convergence. And if I can summarize what's going on, I think what Hong Kong and Singapore have sort of shown people is that, you know, the openness of the market is very important. You know, having open market actually, you know, sort of set a standard and sort of set the tone for the economic development. And for Hong Kong, openness is necessary because we are so small. You know, we got to open to everybody, open to foreign investors, open to open to foreign companies coming to our market. So that kind of degree of openness has helped Hong Kong and Singapore, and we are seeing that other countries are doing something, moving towards that model. Even China, China is on the one hand very you can say very highly regulated, very close, but China recognizes that it's important to open up the market. Yesterday, of course, we heard that the president of Russia talk about joining the WTO. I mean, China recognized the importance of that, and joining WTO a few years ago as a strategic move. This is a way to actually get the industry to move and get the market to sort of play by the international rules. So that's very important. And I think the other thing I would comment on is that in Asia, even in countries like smaller countries, more developed countries, government always plays a very important role. So there's a role for government in Asia that's different from let's say the Western markets. It's accepted by the population that the government has a role to play, and of course in some of the industrialized countries, Korea and even Japan, of course, government play a very important role over the initial stage of the development. And even now, I think there's still a good consensus that government in Asia do play a role, and the public accept that. But however, the success of the economy oftentimes really depends on how good the government is. And many of these governments actually have been adopting much more openness, attitude towards market and regulation. And you can see that also the governments are learning to be more hands-off. But still, there is a role for government, and that is very much accepted by the public. And if I think you asked me the question, what kind of lessons developed Asian countries can offer for emerging markets. I think that as we are now seeing Asian economies moving from the traditional model towards a more advanced model, even Korea and China and all that, trying to really develop service industry. So I think that this change is going to be very significant, and I think what we're going to see is that the kind of market reform and privatization that work in Asia could be a lesson for other emerging markets, and more importantly, the fiscal discipline of the government is very important. I mean, you can see that almost in all these Asian countries, the government they really have a good fiscal discipline. They don't want deficit, and then the large pool of savings, both on the public side and on the private side, where actually was very important to finance a lot of the capital investment in the past. We do need to open, get capital market developed a little more. In the past, I think you're really depending on the savings because the financial market was not that complete. So as we move towards a more complete financial market, that may change. But the fiscal discipline has been very, very important for Asian countries. Let me just stop here.
Thank you for that. Trudy, I guess I'll come back to you from a China perspective. Is that how you see Hong Kong? Would you agree with that, or would you say that the perspective is different?
I think I share what Casey has talked, and actually, I think for mainland China, it should learn a lot from Hong Kong, mainly of its rule of law. I think China get a lot of we call this institutional premium for the past decades. It grows. It's kind of institutional premium, which is from the early stage of capitalism, early stage market economy, and for the future long-term economic growth and development, China should learn from mainland China should learn from Hong Kong to get a mature market economy with rule of law. Totally share. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I guess I always feel like it's sort of the developed teaching the developed, right? Developing. Mm-hmm. And it's always about that perspective of what can we learn from Hong Kong, what can we learn from Japan, etc. Mm-hmm. I just want to reverse the question for a second to this team. Right? What can we learn from developing economies? And I think, Barry, your company's put quite a bit of attention on India. What have you learned from them, or what are they teaching your company?
Well, you're exactly right. We've made significant investments in India over the years. In fact, significant investments in all of the emerging markets, and continue to do so, and will continue to do so. So going back to some of the prior comments, we're very bullish yet for the years ahead. But as you look back on India and you think about the what I'll call lessons learned, what could we learn? What are the things that, from a professional services leader, made India successful? I think there are 5 things. First, I would say the entrepreneurial culture that developed in India. There's example after example based on fabulous work ethic, based on really success-driven activities, based on leadership, local leadership, driving an entrepreneurial culture in India focused on innovation that really helped drive the success of India. And interestingly, in my perspective, as I look at India from an innovation perspective, it's actually becoming more distributed in nature. This isn't just about innovation developing in India. This is about innovation being imported into India and being utilized to drive business in that market. Good example would be last month, Intel Capital announced a multi-million-dollar investment to support technological innovation in India. A very good example of a welcoming a level of innovation. But from our perspective, it is significant and one in which we rely on. The second factor would be the robustness of 2 particular industry sectors with strong commitment to it. And Dominic, you mentioned earlier about the services business, the services sector in Asia broadly. But if you look at India, it basically is the economy of India. 66%, I think, of the GDP of India is represented by the services sector. And so there is a huge commitment to that. The IT industry in India itself is kind of unique because it developed and grew and is substantial, notwithstanding a largely poor and developing country. And so it's a fabulous lesson to be learned. And so I would say services sector. Manufacturing sector is the other sector in India that is quite substantial. It's ranked second as the most competitive manufacturing economy, supported by scientists, engineers, researchers, all focused on innovation, true, but manufacturing. And so I think 2 robust sectors with huge commitment from India to it would be a second lesson learned. Third is talent. India has got strong, educated, young, English-speaking talent that is in volumes significant. The numbers of talented, young, educated professionals in India is very significant, which leads to the fourth, and that is the median age, by the way, in India is 25. Compare that to Japan at 43 and the U.S. at 36, just to pick 3 economies. In India right now, the working population is growing faster than the overall population. And that is significant impact, I think, in terms of the overall lesson to be learned from what is actually going on in India. And then the last one is a capacity to address full value supply chain in the country, from design to engineering to production to market. So when I look at all of that, and I'm now, it's historical, Deloitte has invested significantly in India. We're now at 15,000 people from a very small number of people only a couple of years ago, and we're expecting to grow by 20% yet in the next year or so. So, and it's based upon these factors, and being in the service business, it's very thriving for us. So we're going to continue to invest in India very substantially and believe that those are attributes, that success factors, if you will, that other countries can learn from.
While we're on India, I'm sorry, Shev, I'm going to have to pick on you. Since your age is median age 25, I have to ask, what is the, when you hear these stories about what people describe India, your own personal story and your company's story, it's quite much a product of a lot of these factors. Does this ring true with you, or are there other things that we should be thinking about here?
Well, I think, I'm obviously very old by Indian standards. So, I think the entrepreneurial culture is definitely there in India. And I think our company story in some ways reflects that. Business started in India, went through various ups and downs, became a global business. The business was nationalized in the 50s, then rebuilt the business, started working with Russia in 1958. I've been living in Russia. My father didn't want me to damage the business in India, so he sent me to Russia, moved here in 1990, and have been living here 20 years. So in a way, the entrepreneurial culture is something that I think does exist in India, and I think is one of our strengths. But I think it's maybe a pan-Asian thing. I think around Asia you see quite a lot of that, and I think we've learned a lot from sort of the US and the entrepreneurial culture that really, where the US sets the standard in terms of that. I would say the talent issue is a big issue because I think although in volume terms, there are quite large numbers of people being educated and coming on stream that have a good educational background, it's actually a huge challenge and actually a huge risk, because when you really look out the next 20, 30 years, the numbers of people we have to educate with a relevant education is a huge challenge, because we need to actually serve not just the domestic labor markets, but global labor markets, when we look at the demographic issues that the world is facing. And for us to do that, I think our own educational system, the curriculum, the methodologies, and all really need to be revamped completely. And so for me, that is one of our key risk factors as a country. And if we don't get that right, I think we'll not only miss a huge potential dividend, but we will also face very significant problems going into the future.
I also want to pitch in.
Please.
Just go to back to your question, Basil. Reversing the tables again. What do emerging economies learn from the developed economies? And I think the most important lesson is what they have learned not to do. And that is sink themselves into continuous debates and over the anti-crisis measures. Never leave the problems to your successor, next elected public official. I think that is the key ingredient. But again, reversing the tables, I think the regulators, particularly in India, had been very successful in terms of a very strong regulation for financial sector. They've been very well managing the capital inflows to prevent speculative capital from flight. Second, there's a national, and this also comes back to the domestic growth story, Shiv. I think, and as a foreigner, I sense that in India every time I travel. There's a national unity around the idea of the India growth story. And I think, Barry, you may have noticed that at every level, not just at individual level, but also at a corporate level, the message is invest in India.
So is India the exception? I mean, Dominic, if I can come back to you for a second and say, obviously the rest of Asia, you see aging, you see inflation, you see, there's been riots in China recently, etc. In India, we're talking about national unity and entrepreneurship. So is India the exception, and we should think about the rest of Asia in a different way? Or is that model, you think, is the Asian model?
I think there's actually quite a few different models in Asia. I think India has, I would agree with what's been said, huge amounts of things going for it with the entrepreneurialism and so forth, but it has a lot of challenges. I completely agree with Shiv. I mean, I heard a number, I don't know if this is correct, but something in the order of 320 million jobs have to be created in 15 years. You think about, in the US we're worried about creating 43 million jobs. You think about that. China has this youth unemployment, I think, is a big worry. You have to create the jobs. I would argue that there are many things to be taken from India, but one of the things I would just wanted to add in, which is I think a lesson learned, which is not what India does, but I think others do, which is stable long-term governments, long-term views. I think one of the reasons why China is doing so well, up for debate, is there's more of a long-term perspective. And you find that in Korea, you find that in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and you're finding that now in Indonesia. And that's a big gap compared to the West. I mean, where you've got governments thinking about, at most, 2 years, maybe, and someone mentioned leaving problems for others. I remember we did some work with the Korean government. When President Lee came into into his role about 3 years ago, he asked for a 60-year vision. I remember saying, you mean 6, right? Not 60. He said, no, 60. I said, you must be crazy. I mean, how do you even... He said, well, that's what we like to think in those time frames. And I think that a lot of the problems we have are long-term. They're not short-term. And so that's another part. I think actually India, the government, since is being a little more long-term, but is less long-term, less, frankly, deliberate. Infrastructure is a disaster in India. I have to say, I think it takes way too long to be able to get things done, and it's has huge productivity challenges. So whereas it works extremely well in China, maybe not from a rights point of view, because you'll just get your house bulldozed, but they build the road. So I think I don't think there's an India model, but I think there's components of it that the West can definitely learn from. I wish we had more long-term thinking in our governments to be able to deal with some of the big issues that we deal with. And
just adding to that, if I could, Dominic, I identified the lessons learned from a positive perspective. That there are many challenges, and I think you identified two that really concern us, and that's the infrastructure in India. I think the World Economic Forum identified through a competitiveness survey that India was ranked 89th out of 139 countries in terms of infrastructure, and they did sort of sub-scores for electricity and telephone, and they were ranked 115th out of 139. And for business to really thrive, and for the economy and for India itself to be sustainable, as we're talking about as the topic of our agenda here, something really needs to be done to reform that infrastructure, and perhaps as a lesson learned, to think about that, perhaps as China has done in some ways, investing in infrastructure earlier than perhaps India has.
So, sorry, Ivan, go ahead.
Sorry, Basil. I was going to add something that Dominic said, and you know, when you live in Asia and spend a lot of time in New York and London, you really get a sense of the different political system, I mean, they're all democracies, but they run very differently. And Dominic, you talked about long term, which is absolutely right. But I think it's also a necessary but not sufficient condition, because you have the Japanese who also think long term, and you know, you can see that they've had 2 lost decades, and they look like they're entering their 3rd lost decade. I would add 2 other things. I think the first one is, as Professor Chan said, very commercial. You know, these governments are very commercial. They think about, you know, they think about GDP, they think about regulation, they think about growing industry, growing companies, etc. So very, very commercial focused. And I'd say that the third thing is also willing to change course or adapt the economy or change direction if they see that the world has changed or if they're on the wrong path. And so the combination of those 3 is very important. And they spend less time thinking about getting re-elected at the next elections in 2 or 4 years, depending on what your cycle is.
If I may just add to that, I think perhaps the Indian government and the politicians are a bit too commercial. And perhaps they think a lot about the elections, so that may be one of the issues in terms of...
Let me pick on your accent for a second, Ivan. What about the Down Under and Australia and so on? What is that part of the Asian story? How do you see it, or not? Is it Asia or not?
That's a good question. Look, it's definitely part of Asia. I mean, you know, 50 years ago it was part of the UK and it was Mother England. Whereas if you go to Australia now, you can definitely see it's part of Asia culturally and etc. And you can see that it's economically part of Asia. You know, people forget that less than 10 years ago, back in 2002, the country was on its knees. When you had the tech boom going on globally, people were saying, you're an old economy, you know, you've got nothing to offer in the new industry, you're just a big hole in the ground and nobody wants those commodities anymore. And the Australian dollar was trading below 50 cents. In fact, you could have bought as much as you wanted at 47 cents, and here we are, you know, 2011, and it's got what everyone wants. You know, it's resources, you know, demand is infinite and supply is diminishing, and you can't buy enough Aussie dollars at $1.10. So, you know, very tied to Asia. But I think in some ways, and I was talking to some of my colleagues before at Barclays Capital, you know, just speaking privately as a citizen, you know, disappointing in terms of not squirreling away some savings, given what's going on down there. And if you have a look at what Norway's doing with their sovereign wealth fund, you know, we haven't done that. And, you know, Norway's got 4 million people, but we've only got 20. You know, we're not a massively populous country, and there's been no sovereign wealth fund. We're running a fiscal deficit, and you know how the world works. It's yin and yang, and one day China will slow down and the demand for commodities will come off, and I worry that we'll have nothing to show for it.
I want to bring our audience in a few minutes, but before I do that, I really want to come to the sort of final topic, or final question, if you like, which is this host country that's hosted us wonderfully for the last couple of days. You wouldn't know it by this event, but there have been discussions in the past about, is Russia part of that BRIC acronym or not? Is Russia fit into that story or not? Is, you know, does it fit into that growth pattern? I know we've shifted the time zone. Is that really make it or not?
There was an interesting comment yesterday made by our first deputy governor of central bank that Russia is somewhere in between. So I kind of agree with that to a certain extent, but really it's Russia, just like every other emerging economy, and not necessarily a BRIC economy, is facing similar challenges. And I think President Medvedev framed the concept very well. A couple of years back at the Krasnoyarsk Economic Forum, he identified the concept of what Russia needs to do as a concept of 4 I's: institutions, investment, innovation, and infrastructure. And I think that kind of sits very well. Migrate from largely commodity-dominated economy, with China being the largest buyer of these commodities, and again, that's why we're so close, and we can be affected as a country. But Russia does indeed possess certain skills and certain skill sets in several important industries, which are critical for at least the infrastructure part of that concept. Heavy engineering, aerospace, materials, and it does indeed export even to countries like India some of that. Power sector, you take nuclear power. Again, this is one of its core strengths. It just must commercialize the concept to a much greater extent. What you said about the hangover of communism is very much true, because commercialization of projects and of new ideas and innovative ideas is something that we really do lack. To that 4I concept, I would also add one important piece which came to me from India. It's called inclusion. Inclusion, inclusive growth, which includes the population that is underdeveloped, underbanked, undereducated, etc. Russia also has a population that needs to be included in the growth story, and that also partially must address the issues of small and medium-sized business. So investment climate needs to be improved dramatically, but it won't mean anything unless it serves just one purpose, the productivity improvement. If we don't improve productivity, and that again relates to any country, nothing will change.
Great, thanks. I mean, as a 20-year veteran, Chev of Russia, what's your perspective? Would you agree with Vladi, or would you not?
Yeah, I think Vlad made some very important points. I think Russia has a slight problem with seeing itself as a resource supplier. And so I think that's something Russia needs to become comfortable with. There's nothing wrong with being a resource supplier. And you've got China next door and all of Asia and all that growth. And if you do it in the right way, that's a huge opportunity. And I think Russia needs to get comfortable with that self-image of itself as a resource supplier, number one. Number two, I do think that the Soviet legacy of investment in aerospace and technology and defense and the tremendous education system that was built, which has weakened a bit in the last couple of decades, which I know they are trying to strengthen again. The human talent here is exceptional. and has always been exceptional. And that human talent can be revitalized, ideas like InnoGrad, etc. But I think it needs to be broader. It needs to be countrywide. It needs to be a much broader, longer-term plan. And I think with that, I think Russia can revitalize itself as as a technology center as well. So I think a technology center, a supplier to Asia and to Europe and the rest of the world in terms of materials. And I think those two things, plus strengthening itself as a financial hub for the region and perhaps for global, just like Toronto is a mining hub, there's no reason Russia couldn't be a commodities financial services hub. So I think if you look at those type of things, I think Russia can significantly upgrade the lives of its people. And I think the real challenge Russia faces is a demographic one. And Russia needs to find ways to address that. Because by some reports I've read, by 2025 or 2050 actually, the population, I've seen numbers as low as 90 million, 90 to 125 million people by 2050. That's a scary decline in population. So.
Great, thank you. I do want to bring in the audience now to ask some questions. And so if you can just raise your hand, we can pick out. I always have plenty of questions, by the way, but I prefer to have them from the audience. Let's start over on this side.
Yes, thank you all. It's been a very interesting discussion. In addition to the financial and economic aspects around the Asia growth story, I wanted to ask whether any of you think that the growth story could be impacted by the security situation, the geopolitical situation around Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's the China-India factors around the security situation, and could that have a growth? Does that worry any of the panelists?
You want me to pick on someone, or you have someone in mind to answer the question?
No, I wouldn't do that.
Chev, why don't you?
In terms of India, I certainly think one of the greatest risks for India going forward is some of its border issues. And I think our own internal governance, we're a huge country, 1.2 billion people. We're adding, in the last decade we've added 200 million people. If you look at that kind of growth, the homeland security situation and the risk of conflict with our neighbors is a very significant worry, because the borders are still relatively porous, the cultures are similar, and therefore porosity is increased, and I think it's a very serious concern.
Dominique, how do you factor in that risk? You sort of described a very positive picture. How do you factor the risk in?
Well, I do think I think it's a great question, because I think it's not only political risk. There's food security is a risk. Fight over resources is a risk. Health. We've forgotten about SARS and H1N1. I mean, people know in China, you go into a Tier 4 city, you're talking about Cambodia, Bangladesh style development. This is a. So I think that there's a lot of risks that are. I'm not more an optimist, so I try not to. But there's some big ones that are there, and this issue, the India, Pakistan, even, there's still, I believe, underlying tensions between China and Japan. If you ask youth even in China how they feel about Japanese, where people are, and this isn't a politically correct thing to say, there's, concerns about that. So there's, underneath this, there's those tensions, and that's why what I hope is that it's social capital. That's why I think trade is important, the moving people back and forth, because there are these views people have. And what I worry about is I think the governments there don't want to have a crisis and stop the growth. What I worry about is a mistake. By mistake, a U.S. naval vessel runs over a North Korean fishing boat. You said something, and all of a sudden you get something erupting. So I worry about mistakes that actually trigger something, that events that are there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's take a question on this side.
My question's on India. To what extent, it's been said that India is a dynamic society, but a very sort of weak government, a weak state. To what extent do you think that issues of bad governance or over-governance and bureaucratic regulation can not necessarily derail India's long-term growth, but significantly slow it down?
Well, I think the growth rate you're seeing in India is in spite of, in many ways, rather than with the help of our great leaders. So I think that the hampering is already there. So one can only imagine, if one reverses the thought, that if one unshackles the economy, what could be the real rate of growth? So I'd reverse that view. But I think there's no question that we have a governance deficit in our country. And, we are actually a bit like Europe as India, 16 different languages, 600 dialects, a melting pot of religions and cultures. So India is very difficult to govern. I think it's one of the most difficult countries to govern, and I think it's a huge challenge and a huge opportunity as well.
Is that a function mainly of the sort of Indian state system, or do you think that problems go deeper?
I think the democracy that has been born in, and which has grown in India over the last 60 years has many strengths and weaknesses. The strengths are the voice of the people is now very much there. So I think for India to derail because of one leader who wants to significantly derail it, I think is difficult. I think there are lots of checks and balances in the system. On the other hand, there is perhaps too much debate, too much sort of discussion, and not enough long-term focus and leadership. And that, I think, is where the problem is. And the democracy will mature, we hope, over time. And it's about leaders. It's about finding the right quality of next-generation leaders who actually can create the consensus and be part of the global economy and create a seamless communication between a villager and the global world.
And when I'm in Mumbai, I never know which channel to watch. There's so many of them that you can watch debates on. Barry, with that set
point,
please.
Sorry, one fact and then a little bit of a tangent to express the issue even further. The World Bank there was a Transparency International Corruption Index, and India ranked 87th out of 178. So it's very clear that there is absolute room for improvement in governance in India. The second point would be that it takes a very long time to get through the processes to do business in India. So notwithstanding the environment that I articulated earlier about professional services, today it takes 218 days to obtain a business license in India. Vietnam, it's 50. And so there's yet great opportunity within India to create that type of environment, which is largely governance related.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to a question. Sorry, Vlad, you want to add something?
Yeah,
One second.
I just want to say that on a positive note, that India had been doing liberalization of in many areas of economic activity. Take it financial sector. After nationalization of banks in early 1990s, still going on. Foreign banks can set up branches very easily. Long, but easy, straightforward. Same is happening in other sectors, manufacturing, retail, etc. But I just wanted to point out from a civic point of view, the Right to Information Act, which India enacted, is such a powerful tool that everyone every citizen can know, has the right, and not only has the right, but gets the information that he wants on anything that has to do with either public service or that needs to be rendered, or information about a politician or something.
Thank you. Sorry, to your question.
Yeah, just a quick one. To Dominic in specific, if you had to advise Asia 5 things to watch out for, if you look at Japan, I'm shocked at how terrible things are from a government point of view. I mean, the DJP came in and they were hoping to do 101 things, they've done nothing. It's abysmal. Australia, they've done very well in the mining industry, got out of the mining industry, and it's very worrying. They're not saving any money, and things are not looking too good. If you had to look at Indonesia, came from nowhere, and now under Bang Bang, they've done really well, my goodness. And Korea's come from nowhere, and they've eaten the lunch of the Japanese. It's cool. You go to Seoul now. 5 things you'd say in terms of watch out Asia. What would they be? Because we don't want to be like, we don't want to be like Europe. Europe's difficult now. What would you do?
It's a great question. I don't know if I can come up with 5. My colleagues help, but I think I think there's. Let me put it this way. One is on the governance side. I do think there's something about this long-term thinking, and is there a way to kind of put aside some economic thinking? I don't think should be so much debated. This again may be controversial from a democracy. Imagine if we were all able to vote in the Federal Reserve whether they should raise interest rates or not. We don't want that to happen. I would actually try and keep as much of some of the economic development out of the hands of politicians. That may be a very naive thing. This is maybe a dream, a wish. I don't know. Maybe there's risks with that. But some of the longer-term competitiveness, economic policy, education, these are things you can't keep changing every 2 years. And I go back to Barry's, I agree. I think Japan is the sad case. I think it's actually because they have terrible long-term thinking with their government. They're changing prime ministers like you change milk cartons. I mean, and that's the saddest thing when you've got a country with incredible talent. I still think that's one of the technical meccas, if you could call it, of the world. And then you've got, they're just not making the changes that are required. And I just wonder how long the Japanese people will put up with that stuff. So that this governance thing is a very big one, to keep that perspective in play. The second is, someone mentioned inclusive growth, which I think is very important, because one of the risks I worry a lot about is inequality, rising inequality. I mean, China is fine while it's growing, and I remember living in Shanghai, there was a Rolls-Royce dealership 5 minutes to my right of where I lived, and then 5 minutes to my left was a group of 500 migrant workers living in unbelievably tough conditions. And I used to ask my friends, how can they deal with that? And they said, well, as long as the tide's rising, that's fine. The tide may not rise all the time. That doesn't happen. So I would be focused very hard on the inequality. That is not the government's job. That's business's job. That's our job. Because if we don't have that stability, we're going to have stuff like you wouldn't believe. And I think that is rising in Asia. I'm generalizing, but it's rising. It's something that, interesting what you said, that Bam Bam Yoriodo, he's very worried about that. Everything he talks about is inclusive growth. I think I'm running out of, I only have two recommendations.
Anything, Professor Chen from Hong Kong?
Actually, I think Dominic has some very good ones. I worry about it, also the sort of generational change. Maybe not so much politics per se, but the ideas that now we are going from a older generation who are people who have a social consensus about how to achieve growth, how to make sacrifice, and how to leave things to the government. And in a way, it worked. Okay. But I'm worried about is as we are now going to a new generation, and now the I don't know what, the trickster generation or whatever. So I think the kind of consensus that we saw may not be there, and as Asia and some of the richer countries in Asia become more mature and face some new challenges, then I think that is the problem that I see.
Great. I think we have another question in the audience.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Mandis, I'm from South Africa. If we look at, Dominic has sort of raised an aspect of the question that I wanted to ask, because if we look at China and India, which are sort of powering growth and development in the Asia region, but also globally speaking, they also have huge development challenges, poverty, inequality, and I get a sense that China is more conscious of that, is more sensitive, almost it is horrified by the specter of still having to deal with huge poverty and inequality. India, with a very strongly growing middle class and a very big middle class. But my question is whether this issue is being addressed speedily enough. Is there a real momentum to closing that gap, to really addressing that legacy of poverty? And perhaps an unrelated question that I'd like to ask. I read a very interesting report about the India growth story over the last 5 decades. And it was a very interesting conclusion that was made there, that one of the challenges of today is institutions. And that some 50 years ago, when India did not have the current levels of growth, it had very strong institutions. Now it has very huge growth and all of these things that are working well for it, but the institutions have gone down. Is that a true picture of India? Thank you very much.
Great. So let's take the first question, and I'll go to Ivan, if that's okay. Just say, are they doing enough to close the middle class? Are they doing enough to build that?
Yeah, look, I think Asia in general is very focused on that. And, as you said, China is very focused on that because of just civil unrest reasons. And the Arab Spring has really brought it to the forefront of the politicians in Asia, really across all the countries. And it's not just in India and China where there's still a very large amount of poverty, but it's also in very developed countries like Singapore. And if you have a look at the election held last month, there was a big swing against the ruling party that's been ruling since 1964, and the economy's booming. The economy's growing at 20% plus, unemployment is next to zero, and yet there was a swing against it. And I think that comes to your point, Professor Chan, around the next generation who weren't there to build a nation are now enjoying the fruits, get a little bit fat and lazy and look at other issues. And I think also the point that Dominic made is not just poverty, but the gap between the two. And there's a real sense that even in the countries that are doing well, that the elite at the top are moving away from the rest. And in Singapore, they changed 11 out of 14 cabinet ministers after the election, which is extraordinary. So the point is that they are focused on it, and particularly the Arab Spring has got them really focused on it from what I see.
Chev?
Mandisa, if I may just go to your question, because I think it's a very critical question, and it goes to the heart of what I see is a very big long-term risk, that you really have two Indias. One India which is wealthy, middle class, doing very well, but a second India which is impoverished and completely alienated. And if that happens, I think the chance of huge civil unrest is very real. But the fact that it's a democracy, the fact that people's votes are very, very critical, means the politicians are very focused and conscious on the issues. So they're very aware of poverty, inequality, and all these issues. Are they doing enough? I think no. And I think that partly is a systemic challenge. I think what you will find, though, in India is you will find a huge participation of NGOs and business in social activities, which is unusually high compared to many other emerging markets as well. And I think there's a substitution of some of that work being done by the social work being done by corporates. For example, I know ICICI, Vijay is here, and ICICI is one of India's leading financial institutions. They have a very strong program in social activities. Vijay, you may want to say a few words about that.
Yeah, I think the question was very interesting, and I was actually tempted to jump in. I think your first part of the question, I would dive back to what Shiv just said. I think India is a democracy. The fact, your first comment was around the fact as to whether is there, are people paranoid? Are they thinking about inclusive? I think the short answer to that is there is deep thought. There is deep discussion, and in fact, that's a very strong preoccupation. when you talk to the regulators, when you talk to the senior bankers, this is virtually becoming integral to strategy. And it is being driven very, very passionately. So are we seeing results? I think there I would agree with what Shiv said, that it's very early days, not yet. I don't think we have been able to crack the models of viable success. And I do agree with whatever kind of work that is happening right now. That work is actually being driven not so much by government directly, but more by the private sector, more by people who want to do social service and trying to get into them on their own. So that's actually and these are fragmented initiatives all over which are happening. So there is an attempt that certain corporations like ours is doing to give a kind of an integrated scale to this whole thing. We are investing a percentage of our profits every year towards making investments, research, and trying to build models which can be scaled up. I think we've seen some pockets of success in certain parts of India. Again, I would say early days. But these are the kinds of ways in which we are trying to bring momentum towards these. A lot of attention being given, lot of thought being given at this stage, but outcome, I think it is to be seen. Second part of your question about the institutions.
So, sorry, I apologize. I'm going to cut off just to give time for other people. But thank you very much for that. I'm going to take one last question on this side and then we'll wrap it up for today.
Very small question. What do you think about Vietnam?
Vietnam, did we miss one? Dominic, want to try?
Yeah, very good. We should have mentioned it. I think it's, what, 88 million people, similar I think 50% of the people less than 29 years old. I think it's on the move. And you see a lot of the manufacturing that's been done in China is actually shifting to Vietnam. It's very well positioned in Asia as a logistics hub. I would argue, though, that they're a little further behind on the communist hangover point that was made before. It's still taking time to shift that. It's not in the same level as maybe Russia, but I think it's going to be a very important economy. Lots of entrepreneurs.
Great. Julie?
I should say, just in addition to that, like the rather radical political reform in Vietnam has been very impressive toward China.
Great. Thank you very much. We came here to discuss how sustainable is the Asian economy, and I think what we heard was not only is it sustainable, but it's imperative that Asia plays its role in the global platform. We talked about maybe building a new government system, so I think we're going to have to get a few people together to figure that out and how that may work. Australia is part of Asia, we know that much. China and Russia are more similar than you think they are. India is clearly hot, but has its risks. And Hong Kong and Singapore are definitely cities to keep an eye on or to think about what they're doing. I won't want to close without mentioning Japan, and I'll mention a small little story on Japan, because I think we can't talk about Asia and not have talking about Japan. And I'll tell you the simple story. As the Japanese woke up on March 12th, obviously the day following the earthquake, there was obviously quite a bit of chaos and unrest and people trying to figure out what happened and what's going on. Within our business, people started to ask the question, will the stock market open on Monday? Will the Japanese stock market open on Monday? And that became a very important, critical question for our systems and tools and all of that. And I think we finally, lots of phone calls and meetings and so on, finally somebody managed to reach the head of technology at the Japanese stock exchange and said, will you open on Monday? This was sort of Saturday afternoon. The simple answer was, why wouldn't we? Right? That force and the force of the way Japan and the Asians think is, I think, what I would leave as in terms of sustainability. Thank you very much.